terrorism.
What proportion of MI5's caseload is far-right extremism?
I don't know that number. You can ask me that number. But the point is, the Home Office has identified that both of those two...
These are really important matters, with respect. And so by conflating these issues, by chucking far-right in there, it doesn't do anyone any favours. The vast, vast majority, in excess of 90% of MI5's caseload is Islamist terrorism. So throwing in far-right is deeply unhelpful if we want to have...
Well, but it is included.
There's a moment in this debate where the atmosphere shifts, not because someone shouts, not because the presenter intervenes, but because Zia Yusuf refuses to accept a convenient shortcut, the habit of bundling everything together and calling it balance. What you're about to see is a discussion on extremism that was meant to follow a familiar script. Instead, it turns into something far more revealing. Before we go any further, let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and if you value political conversations that focus on facts rather than comfort. Subscribe and stay with me. This one deserves attention.
Can you see those arguments, Zia? Dan Jarvis, the minister there, was saying the government has rejected this advice, adding, as Polly was saying, Islamist extremism followed by far-right extremism are the biggest threats we face. Do you accept that?
That is not supported by the facts. If you look at Hansard, you will see, unfortunately, not trying to trigger anyone, this is just a fact, the vast majority of MI5's caseload is not far-right terrorism, it's Islamist terrorism. So that is a fact, and you can go and look at it on Hansard.
Yeah, but he was... Well,
so that's the first point.
But he said Islamist extremism followed...
We have a government that is willing to do the most extraordinary gymnastics in order to not actually address the problem. This particular report, for example, talked about how it used the word alleged when it was describing the grooming gangs, where there have been hundreds of people who have been convicted of those atrocious crimes. We know there's been an almighty cover-up. Labour have admitted this by doing allowing some partial inquiries, albeit not the full, transparent national inquiry that Reform are demanding. So what we have is a government that is willing to essentially sacrifice the lives of its own people, as far as we're concerned, at the altar of this virtue signalling diversity. It's time for common sense. It's time for us to have officials who actually do their jobs in terms of keeping people safe. The final point I'll make is the monster who carried out the Southport attacks was reported to Prevent on 3 separate occasions. Who has been fired at Prevent? Who has paid a price for this inside anywhere inside the state system? Those little girls, it was one of the most atrocious crimes we could ever have imagined.
All right,
There's been nobody, not a single person funded by the taxpayer whose job it was to keep those little girls alive has paid any penalty for.
Well, Polly, and should there be?
Well, I mean, there are 2 things that are going on. There's the review of the Prevent strategy in order to be able to identify where there might have been things that need to change about the way the Prevent programme works. And there is also the public inquiry into all of the state failures that resulted in that. Because there were a number of times when that Southport killer was in contact with state authorities and indeed charities as well, and nothing was done. That is the appalling consequence. Those are the appalling consequences is that atrocity in Southport, and we need to understand where and how people need to take responsibility in order to be able to avoid these kind of things happening in the future. But I would want to clarify on the record and correct the records here that Islamic extremism is one of the #1 priorities of the Home Office, as confirmed just in the Commons by my colleague Dan Jarvis.
Right.
It's that and extreme right terrorism.
What proportion of MI5's caseload is far-right extremism?
I don't know that number. You can ask me that number. But the point is, the Home Office has identified that both of those two...
These are really important matters, with respect. And so by conflating these issues, by chucking far-right in there, it doesn't do anyone any favours. The vast, vast majority, in excess of 90% of MI5's caseload is Islamist terrorism. So throwing in far-right is deeply unhelpful if we want to have...
Well, but it is included.
It's included in the priorities of the Home Office.
Right.
That is the clarification on the record that I want to make.
Ben, does the definition need to change? Does it need to be expanded?
Just to add a slightly different take on it from the report, what I find is, I think it's good that, well, I hope they go all the way and kind of push entirely back against this report, but it's good to hear the government distance itself very, very quickly. What I find interesting about it is this is a report that's been developed within the civil service by officials, and I actually think it shows an insight behind the curtain as to how officialdom has managed this type of process in the future. We can go to the Southport, we can go to multiple public body failures, but it also goes to this kind of stasis. The idea that we should act as extremism when you say that there is 2-tier policing in this country is an absolute farce. If anybody says that there isn't 2-tier policing in this country, they are not telling you the truth. The fact that somebody can go to prison and be arrested for alleging and calling somebody a paedophile online, but actual paedophiles are not going to prison, I'm sorry, but that is a two-tier system. The fact that the Home Office thinks that that now should be regulated and looked at as an extremist view shows where the Home Office is at. And I'm not suggesting that's a political point. I'm suggesting from a civil service Home Office point of view, that is a real problem and a real concern that politicians need to be looking at.
Well, Robert Jenrick, the Shadow Justice Secretary, says the officials that produce this factually incorrect garbage, this is the review we're talking about, are unfit to serve the public. They should be fired.
I think that one thing that gets lost in a lot of this is acknowledging that behaviours are incredibly important in this. And what do I mean when I say behaviours? I do mean that it is incumbent upon not just the government, but everybody, politicians, political commentators, the media, to understand that when they say something or write a column about something, that that in itself is a behaviour if it seeks to inflame and cause more social division and put certain communities at risk. Is that extremism? No, of course it isn't. A definition is just a definition. Of course, it means how resources get allocated, and so it has a legal framework there. But no definition is going to please everybody. What matters is that we're addressing the behaviours that cause the harm rather than one based on definitions. And I just would remind people that the language that we all use, particularly those of us on this panel and people that come on this show and people who write in newspapers, need to be really, really careful about the language that they use, because that can tip over into some of the dreadful behaviours that we have seen over the summer riots, etc., that aren't necessarily rooted in ideology.
Well, this is why this exchange lands so heavily, because throughout the entire debate, you're watching two very different instincts collide. On one side, there's institutional caution, an instinct to manage language, avoid sharp distinctions, and keep everything framed as complexity. On the other, there's insistence, a refusal to let complexity become an excuse for paralysis. Zia Yusuf keeps returning to the same underlying point. If the state fails repeatedly, and no one is held accountable, trust erodes, not because people are uninformed, but because they notice patterns. They notice when reports downplay what courts have already established. They notice when failures are acknowledged only after tragedy. And they notice when discussions about extremism focus more on phrasing than prevention. What unsettles the panel isn't anger, it's persistence. Yusuf doesn't attack communities. He doesn't personalize blame. He questions systems, incentives, and the culture inside institutions that seem resistant to self-correction. And when the conversation shifts toward behavior, who gets investigated, who gets prosecuted, who gets regulated, the stakes become clear. This isn't about scoring points on television. It's about whether policy is shaped by reality or by what sounds safest to say. That's why the panel struggles to regain control. Because once someone challenges the framing itself, repeating it louder doesn't work. So here's the real question this debate leaves us with. Do we need more careful language or more honest prioritization? Is the problem extremism alone, or the way institutions respond to repeated warnings? Let me know what you think in the comments. Agreement or disagreement, both are welcome here. And if you want more breakdowns that slow these conversations down instead of inflaming them, like the video, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.